Well, hello and welcome to sunny Dogwood Hall. It's a beautiful day out, and I did manage to mow the lawn yesterday, so I thought I'd come outdoors and make a short video about rolling for initiative in combat for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition. And what we want to cover in this is just a couple of short topics, so this should be a brief video. And I'm kind of doing this as a stopgap because I have not been as diligent as I should have been on getting done with my polity planning worksheet form and discussion of how I've turned this planning worksheet into an actual kingdom or other political unit for use in a campaign setting, in part because I know there's some concepts in there that I may be called upon to explain more elaborate detail after the video goes up, or even defend its use in an RPG system. So I'm that's probably going to be my next video, but I think I just wanted to start off with something a little shorter because I've had a few new subscribers come to the channel since my last video went up, and I just wanted to show that I am still an active channel. I haven't sort of abandoned this to go on to other things. Well, it maybe got a little too sunny and beautiful outside, and the heat was starting to affect my camera and audio, so we moved the whole operation back indoors. We want to talk a little bit now about, hello, Yasmina, what we want to do as far as the course of events in this video. So we want to start off by talking about the mechanics and some of the orders of operations to rolling for initiative. We're going to follow that up by talking about the influences of different actions within a round of combat. Next, we'll talk about why dexterity doesn't necessarily affect initiative the way you'd think it would, and then we'll wrap it up by talking about kind of alternative determinants to the initiative roll itself. And this usually comes into play when one side or the other has more attacks per round coming to them than the other. So if one side is due to have 2 attacks per combat round and the other side simply has the 1 per round, then we're going to do things a little bit differently. Let's start off by talking a little bit about the actual mechanics and the order of operations of rolling for initiative in First Edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Before we even get to the initiative roll, we're going to start with surprise, which is not really a contested roll in the sense that you're not rolling against the opposing force, but each side is rolling to see whether or not it is surprise. This is typically given a base chance of, if you roll a 1 or 2 on a 6-sided die, then you're going to have some surprise. If you roll 3 to 6, then you're not experiencing surprise. And either or neither side can be surprised in any given initialization of a combat encounter. Now, the second thing we're going to determine is the distance between the 2 opposing forces at the commencement of the combat round. And here, just because it's a combat round does not mean that you have to proceed to combat. You could always use your initiative, or the opponent could use their initiative to initiate a parley or truce talk. It's really open. Don't feel pressured to go immediately into combat just because the DM has said, let's roll for initiative. So now in terms of the mechanics for distance, that's also a d6 roll to which you will add 4. And in the distance units, the so-called DIDIT of AD&D First Edition, what you'll get then is a distance of either 50 to 100 feet in the dungeon environment, or 50 to 100 yards if you were to engage with somebody outdoor combat situation. In the wilderness. And then once you've determined which side has the initiative, what this really means is we're talking about whether or not whose damage is going to be recorded first. And if you are the one that is awarded first occurrence of damage, then if you were to kill your foe, for example, that their damage would not, or their attack would not be registered on you. There's also a possibility to come to a tie in initiative, in which case damages are simultaneous. Now, I think that a lot of people have read the books and sort of objectively understand that there's a lot going on during a combat other than just I swing my sword, you swing your sword, then we roll initiative again. So all of this information is going to come from page 61 to page 63 of the Dungeon Master's Guide for First Edition AD&D. And I'm going to throw up here, the first quote is from Gary Gygax, and we're talking about his ideas about the number of minor actions that are actually being subsumed under the single combat round. So what we don't have is a single sword strike or spear thrust or what have you, but rather a number of glancing blows and missed swings, different parries and dodges and feints that don't land any kind of substantive blow that would lead to damage. And then the number of attacks that you have per round is actually then the number of opportunities within that 1 minute combat round that you have to actually do damage. And I think it probably brings us to where we can talk a little bit about the combat round itself being 1 minute. This is all kind of derived from the turn in AD&D, which is 10 minutes, and then that can be subdivided into 10 rounds of 1 minute each. However, those rounds can be further subdivided into 6-second segments. And these are important because there are a number of actions that can occur within combat that do not take an entire combat round to complete. The most obvious of these would be spells. And if you were to go through the player's handbook and look at the casting time for the spells, we'll just use wizard spell, magic user spells as an example. And most of the spells throughout the player's handbook, but particularly the ones from 5th level down, you'll find of the spells that you would reasonably choose to cast while in combat, the overwhelming majority of them are 5 segments or less to cast, so 30 seconds or less to get off the verbal, somatic, and material components to cast the spell. And of those, I haven't subjected it to a statistical analysis, but the majority are 1 to 3 segments. And again, especially in this from level 5 on down. Now, that's not to say there aren't spells for the other classes that take significantly longer to cast, but here we're talking about kind of the offensive and defensive spells that you might reasonably want to cast while you're in combat. So now we know that there's this number of things occurring. I think we'll kind of turn on to why dexterity doesn't have the kind of influence on initiative that you might think. And this goes back to initiative not being a one-to-one, I swing my sword, you swing your sword, but rather any number of minor actions that are being subsumed under this 1 minute combat round. And here I'll put up another quote from Gary Gygax, also on page 61 of the Dungeon Master's Guide. And he kind of talks a little bit about what his thought process was in not having initiative be affected by dexterity. In his estimation, dexterity would be much better served to apply to your armor class. So because there are so many things happening over such a protracted amount of time, 1 minute, especially in a combat situation, that's a lot of time. Gary decided that what he would do would provide an armor class bonus or penalty based on your dexterity rather than have it affect your initiative roll. And that's a little bit different than perhaps later editions or other games where initiative is very important, and or your dexterity or agility or what have you is very important to establishing initiative or turn order when you're in combat. And in some cases, they even break it down by individual character. I know, I think the new version of D&D works that way. I know Dragon Quest does, where your agility score is ranked, and then we go around by whoever has the highest agility goes first, and so on until you get to the person with the lowest agility. That's not the way first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons works. You're simply, there may be other things that can modify your initiative on a per case basis, but it's just not coming from your initiative. So now let's take a look at a couple of film clips. And the first one, this is actually from Captain Kidd. And what we're going to look at is a gentleman coming out of his cabin on board of a ship, starting up the stairs, and he hears a scream. Runs into the room where he heard the scream coming from and encounters a woman being accosted by another gentleman with a sword. And presumably we'd go through the procedures of establishing surprise. It doesn't seem like either of them are surprised. But then you get a feel for the number of feints and parries and attempted strikes that they get, and there's time for the camera to cut away so the woman screams again. There's two people in the adjoining room and they come to the doorway and begin to discuss amongst themselves what are the potential benefits or penalties of involving themselves in this combat or simply letting it happen. The fight then moves from the room in which it started to that adjoining room, and you can see I put a counter on the screen, and it's counting through the different of the 10 segments as they go along. And once we get to that last segment, what happens, what we can see happened, is the loser of the battle was pinned up against the wall or a porthole of some sort. And in that last instant of that 1 minute combat round, he was pushed out the ship and into the ocean below. Now we don't know whether he dies there, and comes up in the movie, of course, but for this particular example, it's not really that relevant. That combat is over. It took one turn, and it had any number of strikes, thrusts, parries, riposts, and so on and so forth, movement from where the combat began to where it finished. But it's still, that's one round, and Gary Gygax was fully aware of that number of actions going on within the combat round. And that's why you have to accept up front that we're not talking about it's one-to-one, I swing my sword, you swing your sword. It's much more about the ebb and flow of advantage within the combat. So if you win one round and then lose the next round, it's sort of, as Gandalf would put it, the turn of the tide in the battle, so to speak. So now we'll go on and look at another example, and this one is from the Magic Sword. And this is going to be a 2-round combat that we're looking at here. And of course, we see a knight riding out of this castle gate, and he's confronted by a dragon. There's here another woman screaming, very popular in the cinema in those days. And the knight, it's not clear, I think, in the first round whether he won or lost the initiative. Perhaps it was simultaneous, but what happens is the dragon breathes a puff of fire and he sort of backs off. So there's another example. It doesn't always have to be a miss. It could just be that the situations and conditions that were going on, that were prevalent during that battle, didn't necessarily lead to any kind of profitable strikes or meaningful damages, that sort of thing. In fact, I don't think it's clear that first round whether or not there were any meaningful damages, but we're going to move on to the second round, where I think it's pretty clear the dragon has won initiative. He knocks the knight off his horse. But I included this second round for another reason, which was namely to show that he has the assistance of a magic user from the parapet wall, and also the villain is standing on the same parapet wall, who's some sort of sorcerer or wizard, that sort of thing. In fact, he is. And so you see some other of the more minor actions. For instance, the magic user has a chance to cast the spell. So she enchants the sword being held by the knight, which is shown by its glowing momentarily. And then the knight turns that sword on the dragon and manages to kill it. So that's a pretty powerful spell if you think about it. You guys killing the two-headed dragon with one sword blow. But then we also see, apparently the magic user has some thieving abilities as well. Perhaps she's an elf. It just doesn't look like it on camera. But she turns then to the villain and grabs a ring off his finger. So she performs a minor thieving action. This is all going on during that single second round of combat. And so that kind of gives you an idea about how it looks. That way you're not thinking about it in terms of that, again, 1-to-1, I swing my sword, you swing your sword. And then the last thing we want to talk about in terms of initiative is where things kind of take a turn. And it may seem like the roll is not as important. And this is when parts of one side or the other have more than one attack. So it may not be everybody on each side. For example, on the player side, it may only be the fighters that have multiple attacks per round. In the case of monsters, they may have 3 or even 4 attacks per round, perhaps more depending on the monster. So now we're talking about having to adjudicate who goes when, and it is only somewhat influenced by the dice roll or die roll. And that's because if there's a party that has 2 attacks per round facing off against a party that only has 1 attack per round, the party with the 2 attacks per round is going to go first and last in that round, and then the party with only 1 attack will go in the middle. And so really, even if the party with 2 attacks has lost an initiative roll, they're still going to go first because they have 2 attacks to 1 attack per round. Now, this if those odds are even back up because both sides have 2 attacks per round, then it becomes a matter of, again, now the roll counts more again because you're looking at the one who won the initiative roll will go first and third in that round. The one that lost that initiative will go second and fourth in that round. So it does still have an influence, and then it becomes even more important. What it basically boils down to is when the opponent on each side that has more attacks than everyone else, in that order, but most attacks to least attacks, if you only have 1 attack per round, then you have to, as the dungeon master, then adjudicate where in the round everybody's attacking. So you know that the person with the most attacks is going to go first and last, sort of thing. And then you try to fit in the other people with an intermediate number of attacks in a way that it makes sense. They try to fit them into the middle. So, if you're fighting a monster that had 4 attacks per round and you only have 1 attack per round, you're really looking at if the monster is 1 initiative, or the monster, it doesn't really matter as much about initiative. The monster is going to go first and second, then the party, then the monster is going to go third and fourth. And so it's still the party going in the middle. And again, this is broken down in pages 62 and 63 of the Dungeon Master's Guide if you want to go through and look at that. And then some other, just last minute wrap up things, kind of left it was in the quotes, but when you're talking about mass melees on, an encounter, you don't necessarily want to get down into the nitty gritty on using weapon speed, weapon length, and even weapons bonuses and penalties against certain types of armor. And like I said, the part about the length and the speed is in one of the quotes from Gygax that I put up on the screen. But even the adjustments to armor class is really intended when you're looking at single combats between similarly armed and armored foes. So it's taking into account that you're wearing scale mail or chain mail or plate mail, rather than you just have an exceptionally hard carapace or hide that's the equivalent of a scale mail or chain mail or plate mail, whatever, or that you have a claw that's like a scimitar versus somebody actually wielding a scimitar that's not necessarily equivalent. So really where you want to use those things is if it comes up in mass combat, it's going to be when there's some ambiguity in the roll. So, where there was a tie and you need to work out which damage came first, you could apply the faster weapon or the weapon with the longer reach as hitting first. And especially in the cases of simultaneous damages, matters less if like the one side or the other has the advantage, and that damage is definitely going to be applied before the other side. But that's really the bulk of what's going on with an initiative roll in first edition Dungeons and Dragons. So I think I'll just leave it off there, and I hope you've enjoyed the video, and that I'll see you again in the next one. Thank you very much.